Russia's big summer offensive was supposed to be a major moment in the war, a moment when everything changed and the Kremlin's forces finally pushed on, breaking through Ukrainian defenses all along the front lines and capturing those all-important towns and cities needed to gain a vital advantage. Instead, the offensive, like others before it, fell flat, and now the situation is getting even worse for Russia. Vladimir Putin's entire front line is collapsing, and the latest statistics show just how costly this war has been for the Kremlin, with Russia losing approximately 5 times as many troops as Ukraine in total. It wasn't supposed to work out this way. On paper, Russia was supposed to dominate Ukraine from day one. It had the much larger force, the far bigger defense budget, a vast stock of tanks, armored vehicles, and other military equipment, and it was one of the most feared military superpowers on the planet. In contrast, Ukraine had a significantly smaller army to call on, and certainly wasn't regarded as a great military nation on the world stage. With all its military muscle and countless advantages, Russia could, and perhaps should, have swept Ukraine's resistance aside and pushed on to the kind of grand and glorious victory its leader no doubt envisioned back in early 2022, when he gave the initial order to invade. Instead, Russia has suffered setback after setback and loss after loss. Its gains have been minimal, its progress slow, and its losses beyond belief. Even this summer, when the Kremlin amassed a gigantic force and threw absolutely everything it had at Ukraine, boldly proclaiming that this would be one last push forward for victory, it once again failed. As we approach the end of October, the much-talked-about summer offensive is effectively over, and the results are nothing short of disastrous from the Kremlin's perspective. Despite this, some media reports have highlighted the fact that Russia did, at least, make some gains here and there during this period. Others have pointed out that Ukraine is currently struggling with a manpower shortage, while drawing attention to the fact that Russia is still somehow finding ways to recruit tens of thousands of new troops each month. This, on the face of it, suggests that the offensive wasn't such a failure after all, and that Russia may even be in the ascendancy, on track for more valuable gains by the end of the year. However, when we start to look a little deeper, the facts and statistics that have emerged in the wake of the summer offensive tell a very different story, and it's one that the Kremlin definitely won't be happy to hear. Reporters at The Economist recently took a deep dive look at statistics, open source intelligence, charts, graphs, and casualty reports, coming to a very clear and definitive conclusion about Russia's current situation and future prospects. Russia's summer offensive is winding down. Many in the West focus on the grinding progress its troops have made and the shortage of Ukrainian manpower it has exposed. But that is to look down the telescope from the wrong end. More striking is how little territory Russia has taken in its third and largest offensive, and the terrible cost it has paid in men and materiel. Unless something dramatic changes, Vladimir Putin will be unable to win the war on the battlefield. The fact that he nevertheless continues to try regardless suggests that he is out of ideas. It's a damning statement, without a doubt, but it's also one that is backed up by reams of irrefutable evidence. Because even though it's impossible to measure with total precision exactly how much ground both sides control, we do have plenty of data to guide us in making reasonable estimates. There are open-source satellite images, for example, and live maps of the conflict that update over time as both sides announce various captures and losses. From that data, The Economist's reporters discovered that Russia has not, by any stretch of the imagination, gained a large amount of ground. In fact, if we examine territorial control charts dating all the way back to the start of the war, Russia controls less ground today than it did at various stages of 2022. The Kremlin even managed to capture over 25% of Ukrainian territory in the early stages of the war, as its forces surged onward, catching Ukraine somewhat off guard and sending in tanks and other heavy armor in vast quantities to overwhelm its opposition. However, once Ukraine began to find its feet in the war and launched its first big counteroffensive, the battle line stabilized. Russia's total amount of control slipped down to around 20%, and it has more or less remained at that exact same figure ever since. This demonstrates how the war is well and truly in a state of stalemate. Time and time again, we see Russian forces push on a little and perhaps capture a few square miles of farmland or the odd abandoned village here and there, laying their claim to valueless fields and crater-riddled streets with the wrecked remains of homes and buildings either side. Then, not long after, Ukraine often finds a way to recapture those locations and push the Russians back. And this cycle continues, again and again, with both sides doing little more than exchanging the same scraps of land. As the Economist report notes, as far as large, significant cities are concerned, Russia hasn't managed to capture a single one since October 2022. It's certainly done its best, committing a colossal force of over 100,000 troops in a desperate attempt to, at last, capture the Donetsk city of Pokrovsk, for example, as well as launching major assaults towards other towns, cities, and strategic locations. But it's all been for naught. Ukraine's defenders remain in firm control of the locations that matter most, like the famous fortress belt of Donetsk, made up of several interconnected cities that provide the Ukrainian armed forces with a firm defensive foothold and strong logistics links throughout the region, including Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, and Druzhkivka. Capturing even a single one of those cities has proven to be an impossible challenge for Putin's army so far, despite their seemingly huge advantages in regard to tanks, manpower, and other military equipment. And if they can't capture even one proper city in 3 years, then any expectations of the Kremlin winning this war anytime soon are clearly nonsensical. Indeed, as the Economist report notes, if the war, and Russia's progress, continued as it has for the last month, it would take until 2030 just for Russia to capture the 4 regions that Putin initially spoke about when launching his so-called special military operation, namely Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. What's more, if Russia wanted to occupy all of Ukraine, as it apparently does, with Vladimir Putin recently going on record stating that all of Ukraine belongs to Russia, then that would take around 103 years, according to The Economist's best estimation. Maybe that's part of the reason why Putin was recently overheard chatting with Chinese leader Xi Jinping about organ transplants and immortality, at one point stating, "It's predicted that in this century it might be possible to live to 150. Well, Putin is 73 now, and even if he found some sort of elixir of youth and made it to 150, that still wouldn't be enough time to see his country conquer all of Ukraine. In short, his dream of conquest will remain exactly that, a dream. The prospect of Russia taking over all of Ukraine is something he will never see, and it's even becoming unlikely he'll see his country capture the 4 original regions in their entirety, since Russia's progress in those areas is still so slow and coming at such an extortionate cost, which leads us neatly onto the most shocking point from The Economist's extraordinary report. Compiling data from numerous sources and using over 200 credible estimates of casualties, the reporters were able to make a highly accurate, reliable, and data-backed assessment of how many Russian lives have been lost and how many soldiers have been forced from the front lines with injuries since the war began. What they found was simply jaw-dropping. Our meta-estimate suggests that from the beginning of the full-scale invasion to January of this year, Russian casualties amounted to 640,877,000 soldiers, of whom 137,228,000 have died. By October 13th, those totals had risen by almost 60% to 984,000, 1,438,000 casualties, including 190,000, 480,000 dead. So even in the absolute best-case scenario, if we look at the lower end of the estimated range, Russia has still lost about 1 million troops, with close to 200,000 of them killed. This ties in with what a lot of other sources have spoken about, with many including the British Ministry of Defense estimating that Russia passed the 1 million casualty milestone during the summer months. If, however, we explore the higher end of the estimated range, Russian casualty numbers may be significantly worse than expected, with possibly over 1.4 million casualties in total and close to 500,000 people dead. Either way, this is by far the worst war for Russia since World War II, by some distance, and when we look at the paltry amount of ground gained in exchange for those horrendous losses, it's also easily one of the most wasteful wars of all time anywhere in the world. Countless lives have been lost, with families forced to mourn the deaths of brothers, husbands, fathers, and sons, all for almost no tangible gain in terms of territory or battlefield dominance. Russia is not capturing the towns and cities it needs to push on. It is not marching to victory. It is instead simply throwing soldiers into the meat grinder with reckless abandon, treating its people as little more than cattle, confident that it can always simply call up more to replace those it lost the previous week or month. For now, there is some truth to that statement, as Russia is still hitting and even exceeding its recruitment targets on a regular basis. This was confirmed in a recent report from Ukraine's main Directorate of Intelligence, UGR, which noted that the Kremlin has called up approximately 280,000 new personnel since the start of the year, and is on track to hit its end-of-year goal of 343,000 new recruits. Again, however, this doesn't quite tell the full story. It's only when we dig deeper that we see how reckless and desperate Russia's recruitment strategy really is. For example, in order to keep bringing in the necessary numbers to counteract its losses, the Kremlin has resorted to enlisting hundreds of thousands of convicts, including rapists and killers, who could eventually be released on the streets of Russia if they survive long enough to serve out their contracts and head back home. Russian recruits have also turned to hospitals, signing up individuals with chronic medical conditions like HIV and hepatitis. People in such ill health are highly unlikely to make much of an impact in frantic frontline firefights. Even the many healthy and able-bodied new recruits in the Russian ranks are only there for one reason: money. The Kremlin has made no secret of the fact that it offers huge cash incentives for those who volunteer to fight in Ukraine, with many men, often from low-income areas, simply deciding to play their part in the war as a way to support their families. This can't last forever, especially at a time when the Russian economy is in such a perilous position, losing mass amounts of money daily and contending with a crippling fuel crisis. The Kremlin cannot hope to recruit willing and able soldiers indefinitely. It's also particularly damning to see that, as The Economist report notes, Russia's casualty numbers have surged by around 60% just between January and October of this year. That makes 2025 one of the bloodiest years on record for the Russian Federation, and it shows just how catastrophically the Kremlin has managed this war and harnessed the resources at its disposal. Still, it stubbornly persists with the same doomed tactics, throwing men into the fire and hoping somehow that the tide will turn in its favor in the end. But as The Economist notes, that is highly unlikely. Moreover, a sudden collapse in Ukraine's defensive lines is unlikely given how the two armies are fighting the war. Constant drone surveillance coupled with long-range precision weaponry has made massing forces near the front suicidal. Incremental gains remain possible, though only at enormous cost by sending small groups of men into the kill zone to stake out forward positions. It is hard to breach Ukrainian lines. Should a breach happen, the advance of massed forces and equipment needed to exploit it is extremely difficult. In other words, the aforementioned stalemate situation is almost guaranteed to continue, and that means Russia is guaranteed to keep on losing more and more soldiers for almost no notable gains in an ever-worsening example of wastefulness and futility. The Economist then dropped an even bigger bombshell. Again, it used whatever reliable sources it could find to work out a reliable and realistic estimate of the number of Ukrainian soldiers that have been killed during the war so far. It found that Ukraine has lost at least 77,403 soldiers since the full-scale invasion began, with another 77,842 missing in action. Looking at the figures for this year, it appears Ukraine has lost a minimum of 8,668 people, though The Economist notes that this is a lower bound and the true figure could be notably higher. However, even if the real amount of Ukrainian soldier deaths in 2025 is twice as high as the lower-bound estimated figure, it's still dramatically lower than the estimated number of Russian fatalities in the same period. In fact, as The Economist notes, the figures show that for this year, roughly 5 Russian soldiers have lost their lives for every 1 Ukrainian death. So even though many news headlines and reports have focused on Russia's rampant recruitment and Ukraine's manpower crisis, the figures tell a markedly different story. If these casualty rates continue or don't improve massively from a Russian perspective, then manpower is likely to become a much bigger issue for Moscow than it is for Kyiv. Because, as stated, Russia cannot keep this up forever. Back when the war began, it didn't have such a hard time recruiting new troops. It offered generous sign-on bonuses, and there were plenty of people who believed in the lies of the special military operation, expecting that they'd make some easy money and be back home toasting to victory with their loved ones in a matter of months or even weeks. But the longer the war has continued, the more people have seen it for what it really is. Now Russia has to call it people who have already shown reluctance to fight, since they have spent more than 3 years on the sidelines, and every new recruit is more aware of what they're getting into, with many likely knowing that they may never go home and see their families again. As a result, Russia may find its numbers of willing applicants start to diminish in the months ahead, and the Kremlin may then have to offer even more lucrative contracts and larger sign-up bonuses, or resort to more desperate measures to bolster its ranks. Russia also can't rely on wounded troops making full recoveries and heading back to the front lines, as an International Institute for Strategic Studies report estimates that only 40% of all injured troops will ever be fit enough to fight again. Thinking more long-term, should the war keep on going for years and years to come, Russia will be reliant on people who are currently teenagers turning 18 and being legally allowed to enter the military. Last year, 800,000 Russian boys celebrated their 18th birthdays, but it's likely only a small fraction would have any desire to put their young lives on the line in Ukraine.